Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shakespeare and Company. Thank you for all turning out in such great numbers on this very sultry Parisian evening. I hope you don't get too hot during tonight's event. Reading Brothers of the Gun, one gets the impression that Marwan Hisham became a journalist not so much by choice as by necessity. Watching his city and his country destroyed before his eyes, and while all around him his family members left to seek refuge abroad, friends joined up to one warring faction or another, and neighbours were either killed by ISIS or embraced their murderous ideology, Marwan Hisham's response was none of these. His response was to pick up a pen, or, since this is the 21st century, often his cell phone, and start documenting in English how much a nation, a city and its inhabitants can change during 4 horrific years of war and occupation, all at significant risk to his life. A lot of journalistic ink has been spilled covering Syria since 2011. Brothers of the Gun is important not just because it's a first-hand account, but because it's an account written by a child of Raqqa, one who knew the city in all its shades, who loved as much about it as he hated, who shared the frustrations, anxieties and divided loyalties of his fellow citizens, and who was thus perfectly placed to be able to unpick the humanity from amidst the horror, as well as the horror from humanity. As Marwan Hisham says at a moment during Brothers of the Gun, I was writing my story. But Brothers of the Gun is also a collaboration of the most intimate kind. Integral to this exceptional book is Molly Crabapple's astonishing evocative artwork, elaborated from photos digitally smuggled out of the Caliphate. With an energy and moral depth reminiscent of Goya, Molly Crabapple is able not only to bring scenes of revolution to chaotic life, but also in the many individual portraits depict the kindness, the sadness, the humour, in short, the complexity of every human life. Marwan Hisham is a Syrian freelance journalist who since 2014 has covered Syria, Iraq and Turkey. His work's been published in Vanity Fair, The New York Times, The Intercept and Foreign Policy. Molly Crabapple was an artist and writer. She's drawn in Guantanamo Bay and Abu Dhabi's migrant labour camps and with rebels in Syria, and received widespread praise for her illustrated memoir Drawing Blood. She's a contributing editor for Vice and has written for The New York Times, The Paris Review and Vanity Fair. Her artwork is in the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art. Praising Brothers of the Gun, Pankaj Mishra wrote, "From the anarchy, torment and despair of the Syrian War, Marwan Hisham and Molly Crabapple have drawn a book of startling emotional power and intellectual depth, while the great Angela Davis called it a revelatory and necessary read on one of the most destructive wars of our time." Please join me in welcoming Molly Crabapple in Paris and Marwan Hisham in Ankara. Okay, this is a bit of an experiment for us. Those of you who've been here before probably find the fact we have one of our guests Skyping in as a little bit unusual, but we also thought it was crucial to have Marwan's voice with us tonight in Paris, and we're delighted he's been able to join us. I think we should begin by talking about the origins of this collaboration. I don't know whether Molly or Marwan, which one of you would like to begin, but I'd like to know a little bit more about where this very special project came from.
I can start. I've been covering Syria since 2013. My first piece was for the New York Times about refugees that were living in unofficial camps in the Raqqa Valley in Lebanon, and also about refugees who had fled to Tripoli in northern Lebanon and found themselves in the midst of another sectarian war. And at the time that I began covering Syria, there was a group of people on Twitter, some of whom were Syrian, some of whom were just journalists and analysts covering the region, that would talk about the war, and Marwan was one of them. Initially, we got to know each other because Marwan gave me information for stories I was writing about ISIS. But as I began to study Arabic, Marwan taught me basically 90% of my literary education in that, and we became pretty close friends. And in 2014, I asked him, I was like, Marwan, do you have any photos of your city? Just the sort of photos that we all have, right, on our phones. And he said, no, but I can take some. And I was like, Marwan, isn't that very dangerous? You're not going to, put yourself in danger, right, to take photos for me. And he was, oh, no. And then he proceeded to completely risk his life because Marwan is one of the bravest and most just iron tough and dead stubborn journalists that I've ever met in my life. And he went all around Raqqa, his hometown, taking surreptitious photos that were the exact opposite of ISIS propaganda. Photos that showed the bread lines, the kids digging through the trash looking for stuff to sell, the wounded fighters in the hospital. We published these on Vanity Fair. And initially, I was just drawing from Marwan's photos. But I knew that he wrote political commentaries in his spare time, because that's the sort of dude he is. And I asked him, I was like, you want to write some captions for these? And he wrote some brilliant captions. We repeated this type of collaboration from Mosul, which was also occupied by Raqqa, also occupied by ISIS, and from rebel-held East Aleppo. And by this time, we really liked collaborating with each other. And I asked him, I was like, we should do something bigger with this. Do you want to do a book with me? And very graciously, Marwan said yes.
And Marwan, so when the idea for the book came up, did you? One thing that struck me when I was reading the book was how we get to know Raqqa before the war. We get to know the city that you grew up in, the city that you went to school in. How important was it for you to show readers in the United States and around the world this particular version of Raqqa?
So, first of all, thank you so much, Shakespeare and Company, for this opportunity, and everyone here for coming. I think right immediately after the third Vanity Fair piece that we've done in somehow different form from the previous two. In a way, with the text, I wrote an article and not just captions. And it was received well, the whole project. And from there, we started thinking about doing something that is more comprehensive than one piece online that should be read for a few days and probably be forgotten because so much online material over there. So the idea of the book started from there, and it took us actually a year until we presented a proposal. And there were many challenges, especially when, as Molly said, with the art, I didn't have enough material except what's in my memory. So we had I had to present her references from in a different way, not simply taking pictures and sending to her, but to try to extract something from my memory, and sometimes trying to find references that are similar from the internet. The part about portraying Raqqa before 2011, as I wrote in the book, I grew up in one of the cities and provinces that were almost marginalized, poor, and with low level of education. Less than half of the city population were educated. And then we were the new generation, the first generation to get the opportunity to go to school. And even study for 16 years in my case at that time, in comparison to our parents, the overwhelming majority did not study at all. So normally we had very, very different aspirations, very different view of the world, and very different motivations to participate in the Arab Spring. So it was kind of the Arab Spring when it started, and everyone started to watching it on TV. We had different attitudes toward it, let's say.
Mm-hmm. Because that is something we feel very much at the beginning of the book, is what is happening is an intergenerational struggle in a way that I think is probably familiar to people wherever they are in the world, in a way where the younger generation want to leave behind or want to go beyond what the world their parents created and the world their parents lived in. And in fact, when the book opens in 2011, obviously with hindsight it's difficult to read it like this, but there's sense amongst you and the two friends that there's a sense of excitement, in fact, about the potential changes that are going to come. And I was wondering, writing it with the knowledge of everything that had happened since, was it difficult to to recall that sense of excitement and that sense of opportunity?
Yes, we came at certain crossroad and in certain time when everything, we were disappointed in general with the whole movement, the people who first started to protest, because the whole movement changed fast and keeps changing always. Like in every year there is something major happens, major events that changes the whole nature of the conflict in Syria. So at that time, more people naturally started to join in peaceful protest, and then the regime started to crack down till a period of time when it was almost impossible to organize protest in the first place, and much of it was militarized, and people started to join the armed rebellion. By that time, started to organize itself in different factions all over the country. So here the split began in the inside the generation that kind of was more enthusiastic about the whole thing, and the divide started in the whole country with people from different old and young, and here until now we see the result of this divide. And this divide is very important because it affected even the strongest relationships between people, like my friends and I. We started to see things differently over time, and the war started to impose itself on us differently. If your brother was killed by the regime, you would have different attitude and you would react differently. And you will enter the struggle against your instinct to take revenge and your ideals. And many were driven by this ruthless stream, I call it, and the priorities started to change from person to person.
And Molly, one thing that I only realised in reading the book, because I hadn't really read around it before actually plunging in, was that you actually accompanied Marwan through this journey. It wasn't just something that sort of he lived through this, then you two got in contact and conceived the book. In fact, as you said earlier, you were exchanging messages from relatively early on in this process, and I just wonder how it felt for you from sort of from a distance, sort of accompanying Marwan on a project to document something which, again, sort of started off as something potentially exciting and potentially revolutionary, and which very quickly became very destructive.
Well, when Marwan sent me the first photos from Raqqa, I couldn't believe it. It was like, so the only way a Western journalist was going into Raqqa, right, was if they were going to star in an execution video at this point. And there was no way that someone like me would ever be able to see inside Raqqa under ISIS. And yet, because of Marwan, I was. It was like seeing through someone else's eyes. It was like seeing in defiance of borders, in defiance of regimes, in defiance of laws, in defiance of totalitarian groups. It was one of the most rare and precious feelings of my artistic life to get those photos. Obviously, working with Marwan on this project was one of the more precious experiences in my life, as well as the more terrifying. He used to text me from internet cafes where he would send me photos of a guy in a suicide belt sitting next to him. And it was absolutely terrifying, but something that I was so grateful to be able to participate in as well. And it's a little bit strange. So memoirs aren't usually co-written. It's a little bit of an experimental form that we did. It's unusual that a book that's written in the first person should actually be done not by an I, but by a we. But we did this book as an equal collaboration with every single sentence in it written maybe and rewritten and fought over and argued over and negotiated perhaps 5 or 10 times between each of us. And doing something like this is both something that, if you're an egotistical writer, like I certainly am, it certainly burns your ego, but it's also something that I learned more from than anything else I've ever done as a writer.
One of the most striking images in the book, and I think it's sort of both as an artwork but also sort of descriptive images, is for me anyways, of the cafe that your uncle developed, and then which had to be left behind and got transformed because of the events that were taking place. And it seemed, in a way, it seemed like sort of an encapsulation of the way that somebody's dreams for their life, somebody's idea for how their life would go, can change in an instant. And that seems to me something which I guess in quite an extraordinary way happens several times in the telling of this book, and as you said a moment ago, has happened on an almost yearly basis in Syria since the Arab Spring in 2011. And I was just wondering if you could just talk to us a little bit about this cafe, because I think it's such a sort of evocative image, and will help people really understand the life you had before and the life that you left behind.
So my uncle was graduated from art school as an interior designer, and then because it's hard for artists, especially in Syria, to find something to live on, and especially painting that he tried to do, you just simply cannot find appreciative buyers. So he had to change a bit, and he decided to go to the UAE to teach there. To teach Arabic, actually. And then he returned after 2 years. Then he went to Qatar, doing same thing, teaching something that is not his specialty, until he decided to return to Syria for the last time, and also work in completely different field, which is construction. And he started as a contractor, working for the government, and then like certainly this phase of his life, because he started to basically to assemble a team to build things, and he became more like an architect, designing things before. I mean, in every project you need to build something. You will have supposedly an architect to do that, someone who is specialized. But my uncle would do the thing himself and then show it to the architect. So finally, he bought his own land and decided to do something, let's say the project of his dream, which is to build a cafe in completely different materials, different sort of exotic architecture and design. And he put basically everything on that project. But by the time he finished the whole thing, it was already, the country descended into chaos, and he opened it for a few months. Then Raqqa was captured by the rebels, and he was able just a few days before Raqqa was captured to flee. At that time, like everyone knew that it was a matter of days. And so he left it behind. Then his son, who stayed in the area, and decided to make something out of it, to just open it for at least at least something to live on in these harsh times. And so he offered me an opportunity because he knew that I wanted access to the internet, and we worked together. I bought a satellite dish, receiver, repeaters, etc. And we started to provide not just to people coming into the cafe, but also people around in the neighborhood through wireless signal. And immediately people started to come, but those people were different from what we imagined. They were ISIS fighters. And in that same week, actually, there was another restaurant on the river that was owned by a Kurdish guy, and that guy used to sell alcohol. So the whole restaurant was confiscated by the rebels initially because they were Islamists too. And then ISIS normally took the place. Then they changed it into kind of recovery center for their fighters. So they started to pour into the cafe, and for my cousin, it was money because those people had no idea about the prices and stuff, and they're strangers, so you can scam them. For me, it was an opportunity to interact with those fighters. What the main motivation for me in this regard is that my nephew joined the ranks for training camp, and his mother, my sister, had to do everything to get him out. She was able to, but he was still sympathizing with the group and the fighters and justifying everything they do and they say, and etc. So I wanted to see these people. I had a religious background, I studied in a religious school, and I wanted to talk to them and see, what's the thing that is so unique about them? What's the thing that is so scary about them? And how could they get easily into especially young people's minds and change them completely? They become completely different persons. Up to the point when, my nephew called me an apostate, which is not something nice, but there were teenagers who we heard that they killed their fathers. They said you're apostates and stuff because their father didn't like the group, and they end up doing jihad on them. So, I wanted to see those people and talk to them, and they were different people they were the locals, the Syrians who joined the group, but they were Europeans, Saudis, Tunisians, lots of Moroccans, and I would say that one thing unifies them, which is hatred and anger. Mm-hmm. And I have no idea what this anger originates. Where was it originated from? But one thing for sure, let's say a French ISIS fighter hates nothing more than France. Like, his whole thing is about France. Whatever happened to him there, he wouldn't talk about it. Tunisian fighter, all what he talks about is the Tunisian Taghut, which is kind of, tyrant or something, and so on. Saudis are so obsessed with the House of Saud, and they simply want, their ultimate goal is to go back someday to these countries and, overthrow these regimes and punish all of those people. Mm-hmm. So this was basically the story. The stories that I dedicated. We dedicated a few chapters for that thing in the cafe, because it was the place that my uncle had had the exact different vision of it, the place that when people would come with family and chill in the Euphrates and whatever, writers, music, etc. And the result was this. ISIS guys. So.
And I just want to describe this cafe a little bit further. Marwan's uncle comes from a village that has a really distinct architectural style. They make these really gorgeous domed houses. And so his uncle conceived of this cafe both as a gallery for his paintings and also as a tribute to the architectural and artistic heritage of the area of Puerto Rico that he came from. So it's filled with stained glass and ponds and fountains and beautiful hand-woven rugs. And it was supposed to be a place that kind of sophisticated artistic people would come and chill, and instead these assholes came there.
I was going to ask you, Molly, about, because maybe you can find it quicker than I can, actually, the piece of art depicting the ISIS fighters in the cafe, and it's quite a, in a sense, quite an incongruous image, because you have there we go. So you have these guys who are sort of intentionally taking on a kind of as you talk about in the book, a sort of a medieval aspect to the way they're growing their hair, the way they're growing their beards, and yet there are some of them that are amputees, and yet they're standing there with iPhones, with going on computers. By all accounts, a lot of these fighters, from the amount they used the cafes, were quite addicted to the internet. Like, it was, in a way, it was their manner to sort of touch in with the world they left behind a little bit. And I'm just intrigued to know, when you were developing an aesthetic for the images in the book, how did that elaborate? How did you sort of manage to kind of pull together all these different kind of incongruous elements?
Well, I was really influenced by Goya's Disasters of War. In fact, I did 82 illustrations in the book, which is the same number of pieces that Goya did for the Disasters of War. I studied those images obsessively, both from a technical point of view, I would look at how he did whites and blacks and grays, but also, I don't know, trying to get the a sense of motion and almost surrealistic horror, but also beauty that he got in a lot of images. And that image in the cafe is really interesting, because it was one that there was zero photo references for. Obviously, Marwan could not take photos of ISIS guys with their limbs blown off, Skyping home. That was not going to happen. So to do this sort of image, me and Marwan worked really, really closely together. First, he almost made me a list of regulars in the cafe, what their injuries were, what they looked like, where they were from. And he would describe things like how they always had to have their Kalashnikovs with him, because the guys in charge of them thought they would, if they didn't have their Kalashnikovs with them, they would just get their Kalashnikovs lost somehow. And he would describe what kind of energy juice they would drink and all of that. And then from there, I would do sketches, and Marwan would tell me what worked and what didn't. He'd correct me. Often he would pose himself so that I could, see what he meant when he said, this guy is sitting like his back hurts, for instance. And from there, I'd pose models. I have a lot of blackmail pictures of my friends pretending to be these guys, and then I would draw the final piece. And for that particular thing, I wanted the first thing that you saw to be the devices, the tablets and the iPhones, and the second thing to be the amputations. So the only hard whites in the whole picture are the bandages and the iPhones and tablets.
And in fact, the internet itself, I mean, it may seem like a minor detail with everything else that's going on, but in one sense, it seems crucial to the way first the protest started, and then the rebellion took hold, and also seems crucial to the way that ISIS not only recruited but also spread their propaganda, and also just to the lives of the fighters. And in addition to your collaboration, I mean, but the two of you, without the internet, there would not have been this book. And I was just wondering if both of you might be able to just reflect for us a little bit on the way, for example, Marwan, I know that you are an admirer of George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, for example, and there are many sort of parallels between these books, but yet at the same time, the existence of this means of communication where two people across the world can be collaborating on something instantaneously seems to put a completely new spin on it. So I was just wondering if both of you could talk about that a little.
Marwan, do you want to start that?
Okay. So just to give you an idea about the importance of the internet, it was only before 2011. It was spread by only in a few places. Fewer houses had the ADSL, and cafes that provide internet. But the majority of people did not have computers, did not have smartphones, did not have any connection except the old phones they used to communicate. What happened in 2013 in Raqqa and other places either before or after, the moment the area was taken from the regime, services stopped. Either because the rebels cut the service to try to blackmail the regime in some way when the regime did not even care, or because the regime intentionally did that, or because of the bombing. So when the mobile coverage went off, the only way to communicate was through the internet, satellite internet specifically, and started to spread throughout the city, and people, especially in More, needed these means of communication. So here they start, because everyone had someone either outside of the city or outside of the country, and there's no way you can contact except to go to an internet cafe and then talk to them. This surprisingly led to first larger number of people using the internet. Secondly, they started to have WhatsApp, then they started to have Facebook, then they started to have other social media. And this really revolutionized the whole concept of the internet. I mean, like for example, for someone like my father and many of his generation, a computer is basically PlayStation. It's something you only video games tend. It's complete waste of time. That's the computer, and the phone is something kind of similar. But here, people started to see it as its practical thing. Like, I could not imagine, probably very few people in maybe Aleppo and Damascus would work through the internet from their houses. It was completely alien thing. Like, people cannot believe it. I mean, until now, so many people, when I tell them that basically I work from home through the internet, it's still too much for them to understand how. And so when people started to connect, they started to read, they started to interact with people from outside the country, they started to even learn English. Like even Tariq, my friend, who joined an Islamist group called Ahrar Sham, and was busy fighting, he started to learn English, more English words here and there, and was able to even post on Instagram in English. These things, the internet changed the whole perspective, changed so many things, and kind of moved the society from an era to another era. When they are, for the first time, they had contact with the outside world. Before, they only had satellite channels. They stopped being just receptive, but also they started to interact, which was really important in my opinion.
And I mean, for me, I got online when I was 13. There's a lot of very embarrassing political posts I made on Usenet that fortunately I was wise enough to use a pseudonym under, because I was very sure of my opinions at that age. And I think I was one of those people that genuinely thought that the internet would bring on a sort of golden age of democracy and tolerance, because I thought at one point some years ago that if everyone could just talk to each other, we would all realize how much we had in common and we would stop fighting stupidly. I now realize this is not true, actually. I mean, I'm from America. You know, I see what American Twitter's like. But in 2011, in New York, my hometown, we had a movement called Occupy Wall Street, which was a movement against government corruption, against the huge divide we have in America between rich and poor, against police violence. And I took part in that very enthusiastically. And that was a movement that was really, really powered by the internet. It was something where every time police would tear gas some young women in the face, within seconds that would be online and it would be spreading everywhere, and it would be fueling more protests. And in 2011, there were a lot of movements like that. There was, Tahrir Square in Egypt, the revolution in Tunisia, the Syntagma Square protests in Greece, or the Indignados movement in Spain. A little bit earlier, also the London student protests were very motivated by the internet as well. And at that time, it seemed like that the internet was going to be this amazing thing, and social media was going to be this amazing thing that was going to fuel all of us to go to the main squares of our city and sit down and say that the old corrupt machine was dead and build something new. But I think that what I certainly didn't realize, and perhaps many people didn't realize, was we never realized how easily our beautiful internet would be co-opted. And we never realized how easily hierarchicalist, structuralist movements could be outflanked. And we never realized how sturdy a machine that a government was. And as someone who, I flew back to New York from Greece to vote against Donald Trump, and I cannot help but think that the fact that we have an orange fascist currently ruling my country is in large part because of the delusional, tribal, and fascist politics that have blossomed so much on social media in America, and I think that are also happening around the world. I owe my whole career as an artist to the internet too, and I would not have met Marwan without the internet. So, there's that Gramsci quote that I'm going to butcher, just like it's always butchered, so you'll stand by me, which is that the old world is dying and the new world has not yet been born. And in the middle part, see, I don't know the actual, there's a sophisticated word, I don't know it, I can't pronounce it, sorry, I didn't graduate college, but in the middle part, that's the time of monsters.
Mm-hmm. I think, and that's the thing, isn't it? It's sort of what you just said. It has that sense of sort of, there might be new means of communication, there might be new ways of doing the things, but so if left unchecked, old dynamics force their way to the front. And that was something which struck me, one particular section when reading about life under ISIS in Raqqa, where you write, the Islamic State built what looked like a distinctive form of colonization. They fought locals and usurped their properties. They kidnapped local kids and enslaved, raped and forcibly married local women. These guys were born in Europe from European families, and none of them, I could safely say, had ever heard of Raqqa before 2013. And I have to say, when I was reading that, it really it brought me up short, and it really sort of struck me. That is a perspective which, however much you read about Syria in Western media, that's a perspective which we never really get, actually, about is how foreign this Islamic State was even to the people of Raqqa. In fact, you guys were invaded and colonized by these forces, and yet, as you then point out, when there is an atrocity in Paris or in Belgium, the first response from the governments is to drop bombs on Raqqa civilians.
Yeah, definitely. So when ISIS guys migrated from their countries and came to Raqqa, they especially Europeans, because they came from advanced countries to third world country, and they wanted to build a utopia. It's true. But also they were condescending in the way how they looked at people and how they, dressed, how the city infrastructure is poor. People's, most of them are uneducated, and poor, and all of these things. So they even had a term for us. They called us the commoners, as of and they were something, must be the elite or whatever. So like they were always even I think some British fighter wrote in his diary that was either he published it online or someone got access to it and published it, and he was complaining about the Syrian food, about the Syrian women, and about people in general, how they're kind of uncivilized.
They don't appreciate the great man and all he's done for them.
Yeah. I mean, this view like I mean, it helped show them as they are, but also, as I said earlier, the thing with them, especially people who migrated from distant places, the issue for them is that was kind of different. I mean, first of all, they're poorly educated in their own religion. Many things they do not know about. But there's something that driven them to go there, and they still had their country, back in their minds. They wanted some sort of revenge. Even those who married Syrian girls, whether they kind of, the local population there joined them, or kind of, I mean, people were so reluctant, but some people might be, motivated by money or whatever. So even those people, like they weren't happy in the quality of life in Syria in general, and were complaining about it. But also they always they run from certain country. They're full of hatred towards, and all what they want is someday to go back there and do something terrible.
And I think it's also really important to note, and this is something that reminds me of classical colonization, is that a lot of these ISIS fighters thought that Raqqans were bad Muslims. They thought that they were like slutty, they thought that they were not practicing Islam right, and they thought that these fighters thought that in their infinite wisdom they were going to go on a civilizing mission into Raqqa and teach Raqqans how to be good Muslims and build an Islamic utopia in Raqqa, even though a lot of them barely knew the basic elements of their own religion. And that was an essential element to the condescension with which they treated locals there.
And I think one of the most chilling lines in the book is when you write, ignorant of history, I believed no side's victory could be guaranteed without the people's support. Whereas in fact, what we see is this is sort of the ISIS didn't by any means have the people's support. They oppressed the people, they brutalized the people, and yet it was the people that suffered when foreign powers like France, like Russia, started dropping bombs on Raqqa. And I think that's a kind of the sort of the awful irony, in a sense, of the situation. I think we're going to finish quite soon, but I think we are going to try and take a few questions from the audience. If you do have a question either for Molly or for Marwan or for both of them, please try and keep it as short as possible, and let us know who your question is directed at. This gentleman here can kick us off.
Hi, good evening. Thank you, Molly, for your book, and have been following your works on Syria since the beginning, in refugee camps in the Lebanon and in the north of Syria, in Aleppo and in Turkey. Thank you very much. مرحبا مروان، نحن فخورين كتير فيك. أنا من الشام وسعيد كتير إني عم بحكي مع شاب من الرقة. أنتوا أبطال ولازم تكونوا فخورين بالشغلات اللي عملتوها. I've been wondering. I was telling him how I'm delighted to speak to him. I'm from Damascus. He's from Raqqa. Can you tell us now, how is life in Raqqa? It has been liberated since about 9 months ago. And how is life now in Raqqa? What do you think about SDF and the local governance? Are people going back to Raqqa? How can we do for people to go back to Raqqa? And the essential thing is how can we combat Daesh, the Syrians and Europeans and Americans, to not let them and their ideology come back to the region anymore? Thank you very much. Bravo.
Thank you. So all of these are linked together. The city is now devastated. The percentage is from 80% to 90% of the houses destroyed. Still, there are few neighborhoods that are still kind of livable, but many people were internally displaced. The numbers estimate that by the time the battle started, the final battle for the city, there were around 100,000. So the majority of those people, of course, probably tens of thousands killed, but many others were able to flee to the countryside. And then once the city was captured by the SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, they returned. They started to return, and of course, many houses were empty already. So there's effort, and the city. I believe the city will not be built, but by people, with all these modest. Most of the people are poor, and most of them are already suffered a lot, but they're the ones who are going to build the city. In terms of an effort to rebuild the city, there's zero. I mean, there's no serious effort to rebuild it. Like they're barely providing basic services like water. And people themselves are now providing electricity. They're buying generators and providing to a number of houses around them. And the internet, same thing. Jobs now, what is the most common job is basically cleaning the streets. The city needs lots of money and a huge effort to rebuild it. And if the situation kept this way, definitely, I mean, life there right now is definitely better than it was before, and it's improving by the day. But still, especially the anti-ISIS coalition. That consists of, I think, 56 countries or probably more, and most of them are rich countries. And they're the ones who did the most damage when it comes to the infrastructure. So they are responsible to rebuilding it in one way or another. And if they did not do that, it would... Devastated cities, devastated populations are the perfect place for ISIS to go and to re-emerge. And this is proven. I mean, it's built its whole legitimacy on the allegiance of people. And I'm afraid of one thing: people have short memory. ISIS will not return like in a year or two. But in 10 years, if the situation did not improve, and if they were persecuted in some way, if they had the same grievances, I'm afraid that ISIS could find a way to return, and then we'll go back to the same circle. An international effort to out of these cities again, destroy cities, then people go back, then same thing. We will end up with this endless cycle. So I really hope that these countries put puts an effort there to rebuild the city, people would be encouraged to come back. There's also main obstacle here, which is related to the behavior of the local groups that taken the city from ISIS. In many ways, they're far better than anyone before them, but including the rebels and the regime before. But also, the main issue is that they're chasing after young people to conscript them, and this is really important issue. Because most of the people there, they can't just send their children outside. They'll try to move, and people outside will not be encouraged to move to the city. So there are certain things that need to be fixed urgently, and I hope that we will never see that group or hear of it again.
I think we've got time for one more question, maybe, if anybody would like to. Yeah, this lady who will just get a microphone to you.
Thank you very much, Molly, and thank you, Marwan. I have two questions. Will the book be translated into Arabic? And the second question is, I think I saw on your Twitter feed that Marwan wasn't allowed to travel to some place, but is there hope that he'll be able to travel, I don't know, to the UK or to the US to promote the book?
In terms of Arabic translation, our publisher has the foreign rights. So if an Arabic press got in touch with us, I mean, we would love for it to be translated into Arabic, but ultimately they have the say over that. So if anyone runs any Arabic presses here, you can get in touch with Random House. We'd be very grateful, and that would be really cool. In terms of travel, Marwan, do you want to explain travel stuff?
So it's related to 3 countries. If I want to, for example, to come to France, first I need to renew my Syrian passport, and it takes long time, lots of effort, and I mean, if you go to the Syrian consulate in Istanbul and just watch the scene, they're deliberately humiliating people. So if you get that, then you need to have Turkish residency to be able to come back. And then you need the visa. And each process of these really takes huge effort, lots of money, and in many cases, with effort and money, and still they can't be done. So this is how difficult and complicated it is.
Well, I hope at least one day, however long it takes, we will be able to welcome you to Shakespeare and Company in person. That you're definitely there will be a bed waiting here for you. You just give us the word.
They're very nice now.
I think none of you will be in any doubt what a extraordinary, important, moving book Brothers of the Gun is. We have plenty of copies at the till. I hope as many of you as possible will go home with them. I'm sure Molly would be delighted to sign them. We also are very grateful that Marwan signed a whole bunch of book plates in advance, so you will, if you do buy Brothers of the Gun today, you will be able to have it signed by both of its authors. Please do stick around to continue the conversation. We will be serving wine as usual. But please also just join me one more time in saying thank you to Marwan Hisham and to Molly Crabapple.
Thank you, Marwan.